Good evening, everyone. You took directions so well. We have like 2 minutes to spare. I didn't know what to do, so we're gonna get started. I was gonna do a comedy act, but I've been advised not to. My name is John Hennessy. I'm the director of the Maine Episcopal Network for Justice and your host for this evening's program. Thank you all for joining us on this special evening to honor Bishop Stephen Lane on the occasion of his retirement as the 9th Bishop of Maine. I'd like to thank our friends at the Maine Council of Churches for co-sponsoring this event and helping to develop the program. I'd also like to thank my dear friend and fellow parishioner at St. Luke's, Liz Parsons, for helping put this evening together. I think you'll agree we've assembled an impressive group of people to talk about public policy issues that Bishop Lane has addressed over the course of his episcopacy. We are honored each presenter and panelist is here to offer their unique perspective of how putting their faith into action made a difference. I want to thank everyone for participating tonight and the ongoing commitment to faith-based social justice. I would especially like to thank Bishop Lane's colleague and friend, Tom Ely, Bishop of Vermont, who drove a long, long way with his wife Ann to get here this evening. And I learned the bishop was just honored this morning in the Vermont legislature for celebrating 18 years of service to the state of Vermont. Thank you for being here with us. Now I would like to invite Liz Parsons to the podium to lead us in the opening prayer by Rabbi Jack Reimer.
Let's pray. We cannot merely pray to God to end war, for the world was made in such a way that we must find our own path of peace within ourselves and with our neighbor. We cannot merely pray to God to root out prejudice, for we already have eyes with which to see the good in all people, if we would only use them rightly. We cannot merely pray to God to end starvation, for we already have the resources with which to feed the entire world, if we would only use them wisely. We cannot merely pray to God to end despair, for we already have the power to clear away slums and give hope if we would only use our power justly. We cannot merely pray to God to end disease, for we already have great minds with which to search out cures and healings, if we would only use them constructively. Therefore, we pray instead for strength, determination, and willpower to do instead of merely pray, to become instead of merely wish, that our world may be safe and that our lives may be blessed. Amen.
Thank you, Liz. Our good friend and fellow Episcopalian Angus King could not be with us tonight. The senator is traveling internationally but has sent a special video message to share with you. Before showing the video, I'd like to publicly thank Senator King for his service on behalf of the people of Maine. He is always personally welcoming people to his D.C. office, usually on a Wednesday, with a smile, and if you're lucky, a homemade blueberry treat of some sort. The last 2 times I've been down in D.C. working on public policy issue, our day started with the junior senator. These visits were conveniently scheduled to coincide with Capitol Coffee, a weekly welcome for people from Maine. The time is always after the weekly Senate prayer meeting, but you'll hear more about that later. One time, Bonnie Rodden, Jane Field, and I walked into the office with our D.C.-based colleagues from the National Arctic Wildlife Protection Group to talk about our opposition to drilling. Angus was his usual graceful and animated self when he greeted all of us, including the people he didn't know. We had a terrific conversation and left ready to tackle our day on Capitol Hill. Once we got outside the office, our friends from the other states were in awe, asking us, "Is he always like that?" We laughed and said, "That's Angus, and that's how we roll in Maine." Just last month, the same scenario, but this time I was there with another couple of Mainers and other DC-based advocates talking about LGBTQ aging issues. What happened? Angus greeted us with a big smile and a genuine interest in knowing more about the challenge of aging in the LGBT community and how could he help. Our national advocacy partners were similarly impressed, and we just smiled and said, "That's how we roll in Maine." Here's the message from Senator King with a special guest some of you will no doubt recognize.
I have an expert on that subject who is joining me, and I think you may recognize him, Bishop Michael Curry, presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, who's here in Washington this week. We just had a wonderful morning prayer service, and I thought you might enjoy having greetings from your old friend at the top of the church. Bish?
Hello, my friend. How are you? Congratulations to you. Congratulations on the opportunity to retire. But above all, congratulations and thanksgiving for the remarkable ways that you, through your faith, have been a source of unity and hope and love in this world. So blessings on you and Gretchen. And my friend here, the senator, has just been singing your praises.
Well, and we talked this morning in morning prayer about all of us being members of God's family and all of us being brothers and sisters, and that's what Bishop Curry preached about this morning. He started to pause in the middle and said, "I don't want to go on too long." I interrupted him and said, "Preach, man, preach, keep going." But I know that's what you're talking about. And in this world, too often we see religion as something that divides us, when in reality the message of all religions is to love one another, to look after one another, to treat each other as brothers and sisters. That was your message this morning.
You got it. This guy's a real good amen corner. I want him to travel with me normally.
Well, Steve, congratulations. I'm sorry, I should say, Bishop, congratulations. Wonderful to have a chance to visit with you and the people in Portland. And again, thank you for what you've done for the church in Maine and for what you're continuing to do, and I'm sure will continue to do. Congratulations and thank you.
Yeah, you have to chuckle just a little bit that he apologized for calling you by your first name, but did you hear him refer to the presiding bishop as Bish? Yeah. I don't know. Tonight, we are pleased our dear friend Marge Kilkelly, former state senator, senior policy advisor to Senator King, is here to join us to speak about faith in the modern world. Marge is from Lincoln County, having served both as a representative and senator, focusing on agricultural issues and many others of importance to her rural constituency. Marge confirmed for me that she's a veteran of General Convention, having been elected as a deputy in 2000, 2003, and then again in 2012. But she couldn't attend in 2012 because she started working for this upstart long shot campaign for a senator in Maine, and she missed that opportunity. But she gave me some advice when we were going to Austin last July. She said, "John, resolutions are great, and they're a necessary first step, but you need to get them funded so that we can do some good work across the church." Please welcome Marge Kilkelly.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Bishop Lane, and everyone for the opportunity to be here tonight. As I was saying earlier, the chance to bring politics and faith together in my life is like nirvana, so I'm just in my element. I'm an unapologetic politician. I believe that politics and policy making is a calling. I'm also a person of deep faith, having been welcomed into the Episcopal Church a bit over 40 years ago, and grateful every day since. I'm a person who believes in sound policy and governance, guided by values, faith, science, and facts, and the separation of church and state. That may seem like an oxymoron, but in fact, as with anything associated with faith and politics, it's neither simple nor straightforward, but based on a complex process of experience, beliefs, and values. Separation of church and state was a lesson I learned at 7, when my parents decided to move back home to Maine. For 3 years, I'd attended parochial school, where catechism was a subject after reading. We attended Mass every morning, and now I was starting a public school in the middle of the year in a new state and in a new town. After being introduced to the class where I knew no one, I was assigned a seat, and the teacher said we should all fold our hands and bow our heads for prayer. Finally, I thought, something that I knew. We all confidently said the Lord's Prayer. I felt the comfort of those familiar words and felt myself relaxing. This was going to be okay. But when I said amen, they kept going. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory now and forever. Amen. My head started spinning. My blood ran cold. What was this? I felt very different, very strange, alien, not part of this class. I can, to this day, close my eyes and see that room and feel those feelings. All those feelings of fear, and I was just a Christian of a different flavor. So many times since then, I've wondered, how would I have felt if I'd been Hindu or Buddhist or Jewish or Muslim? Over the years, you can imagine that many people have asked me about supporting prayer in school, and my response is always, whose prayer? And then I tell them that story. So why is that important in the context of public policy? Because the concept of separation of church and state became a barrier to me much later as an elected person. As a legislator, I felt it was a bit untoward to publicly discuss my faith or the faith reasons for my policy decisions in the legislative process. It took years and another experience for me to realize that what was critical was the separation of church and state and the integration of faith and policy. As a legislator, I observed that there seemed to be two types of Christians in public policy, and bear with me if I overgeneralize just a bit. But there were those who were very vocal about being Christian, and those who just quietly went about being Christian. I noticed that the policies the two groups supported tended to be about 180 degrees apart, and the folks who loudly proclaimed their Christian faith generally supported policies based more on fear and control, and the quieter Christians supported policies based on love and support. I was very frustrated. I knew what I did. I knew that God knew why I did what I did. I believed I was doing God's will, caring for my brothers and sisters in whatever policy was before me. And I felt angry that the term Christian was being co-opted and attached to policies that were far different from mine, and yet I didn't know what to do about it. Then one day, I was invited to be on a panel before a school assembly. The topics were to be the hot topics of the day, primarily the protection of people who were gay and lesbian in housing, credit, and employment. A difficult conversation in a very conservative town. There were 4 of us on the panel, a couple of political types and a couple of folks representing interest groups. I sat next to a person from the Maine Christian Civic League. We exchanged pleasantries, and the audience questions began. Early in the process, I noticed that he prefaced every answer with, "As a Christian, I believe." I found that interesting. And then, seriously, an angel whispered in my ear, "Well, you're a Christian too." I thought, I am. This could be really interesting. My next and all following responses started with, As a Christian, I believe. My seatmate seemed a bit startled by this. Frankly, I quite enjoyed it. My responses didn't change. His responses didn't change. We didn't yell at each other or challenge each other's Christianness, but each of us had an opportunity to show how our faith helped form our values and how our values formed our positions on policy. My truly favorite moment in that event was one of the final questions from a student in a school football jersey sitting in the back of the bleachers. He seemed a bit uncertain about posing a question. You could almost feel his need to ask. He directed the question to my seatmate. "I've not really studied the Bible a lot," he said, "but one thing I've read is God loves everyone. Doesn't that really just mean everyone?" He sat down and my soul cheered. I don't recall the answer because, frankly, it doesn't matter. What mattered was that he thought about it and had asked the question, a very brave question from a somewhat unlikely person. When we do not frame our policy positions within our faith, we are hiding our light, the light of Christ, under a bushel. By being silent, we are actually fostering the idea that all Christian policy is right of center. If in any audience there is one person who is confused by the term Christian and how that might fit into their beliefs, maybe, just maybe, we can offer them a new way of looking at how being aware of the love of God can be part of their lives as well. Why is this so important today? We live not just in interesting times, but in frightening times. The things that divide us are deep and hurtful. Screaming has supplanted conversation. Friends and family are divided over social and political issues. As Bishop Lane so eloquently put it, in the current polarized political environment, people of faith must exercise their voices of love and moderation and do our best to bring God's love and compassion to our civil discourse. We are called by God to do the work He has set out for us to do. In public policy, we must frame our conversations in the context of our faith, honored and humbled to use the term Christian, and boldly proclaiming how our Christian faith frames our position. Living our faith is essential, but I believe that it is in talking about our faith in the context of public policy where we can really make a difference. It is the message of hope in God's love that we share with people who may not hear it in any other way or any other place. Thank you.
All these presenters are under a very, very tight time frame, so that if they're talking really, really fast, that's why. I would just want to say, using a phrase that our good friend Governor Janet often says, after 6 years plus of commuting to D.C. and coming home, welcome home, Marge. We're thrilled. Until last fall, Heidi Schott served as canon for communications and advocacy in the Episcopal Diocese of Maine. Except for a 2.5-year departure to build her advocacy chops with the Genesis Community Loan Fund, she worked for the diocese beginning in 1998. Together with Bishop Lane and myself, she's a co-founder of the Maine Episcopal Network for Justice. In September of 2018, she was named Communications Director for American Friends of the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem, a Connecticut-based nonprofit that raises support for the 24 humanitarian institutions, schools, hospitals, and centers for children with disabilities that are owned and operated by the Diocese of Jerusalem in Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Jordan, Israel, and Lebanon. Despite jumping ship, her words, prior to Bishop Lane's retirement, Her love and admiration for the people of the Diocese of Maine endures. Please welcome Heidi Schott.
Thank you. Last Friday evening, I thought I'd have a little fun with John Hennessy. And so I texted him that I'd practiced my talk and had honed it down to 20 minutes. I felt bad the following morning when he called to ask, you were kidding, right? And I was kidding then. That's before I dug in to my files to unearth 10 years worth of social justice advocacy history for policies advanced by the Right Reverend Stephen T. Lane. Now, this evening, I don't bear the weight of talking about every issue that Steve holds dear. Thankfully, there are other people with much more expertise than I have who will follow me, and I'm grateful for them. As you may recall, in September 2008, shortly after Steve was installed as Diocesan Bishop of Maine, by the way, things really started to go downhill. The housing market collapsed. The banks that were too big to fail began to fail. Gasoline got up to $4 a gallon. We were warned that the crisis could prove to be worse than the Great Depression. We couldn't know then that it wouldn't come to pass, so we were cloaked in this is how I felt, we were cloaked in this oppressive air of unknowing and uncertainty at that time. And then, just after Barack Obama was elected, there was a rash of racist incidents across Maine, you might remember. There was a reference to lynching at a convenience store in Standish, anti-Semitic graffiti on a synagogue here in Portland. One morning, after yet another headline announced a new act of hatred, Steve showed up at my office doorway at Loring House and said, "We have to do something about this." And so began 10 years of nonstop doorway conversations. Truly, hundreds of conversations. Some lasted about 10 seconds, some went on for a half an hour, who knows, but lots of conversations about how he might speak out on gospel issues to the wider world. There's a bill in the legislature we need to get in front of, I might suggest. Or I'd be home at night watching Mad Men or something, and I'd get a text and a link to a news article. What do you think about this? And over the years, these conversations resulted in dozens upon dozens of op-eds, pastoral letters, public statements, blog posts, legislative testimony, meetings with elected officials, press conferences, events like the Civil Discourse Panel and the Neighbors Standing Shoulder to Shoulder events here at USM. I came up with a list of 19 issues that he has addressed publicly over the course of his episcopate. From child poverty to climate change, from welcoming new Mainers to affordable health care. It's a crazy long list. But here's the truth. He took a pass when asked to make a statement on elver fishing. Baby eels just aren't in the wheelhouse as Episcopalians, so we left that to the marine biologists. Now, parenthetically, you'll notice that I can't help but use the first person plural, and that's instructive to the way Steve Lane operates. Everything about his leadership begins with the pronoun we. Now, just as the financial crisis didn't start in 2008, Steve's commitment to social justice didn't start then either. Steve's introduction later in the program will share more about his early life, but let me say this, mostly because I wanted to show that photo. As a freshman at the University of Rochester, Steve's campus job was in the dining hall where he worked with young African American men his age and middle-aged immigrant women. That was an eye-opener for him. And when they went out on strike, he went too. As a conscientious objector during Vietnam, he had to find a job that was as low prestige as an Army private. And apparently being youth leader for the Diocese of Rochester met that criterion. From that work came a call to seminary, ordination to the priesthood, and eventually election as the Bishop of Maine. However, I think it's safe to say the most wonderful, to use a word he often employs, wonderful, the most wonderful outcome of that job is that is where he and Gretchen met. As bishop, he submitted testimony for dozens of bills across a wide range of issues over the years. But because of his busy schedule, either I would testify on his behalf or we would ask a clergy person to go up to Augusta. Steve was only once able to testify before the Joint Appropriations Committee. I think it was on a supplemental budget bill. But what I do remember is this. I arrived early to sign up for a testimony slot outside the hearing room, and he texted me to say, I'm here. So I went down to meet him in the lobby where they had started to, at a certain point, they had a metal detector, and security had begun being set up there. And I stepped into the lobby to meet him just as he was going through security in time to snap this photo. Now, it's a little blurry, it's from my phone, but I thought, oh my God, his pectoral cross must have set off the metal detector. And he was just signing something, and I thought, they've confiscated his cross. Well, it's a big cross. You could really hurt someone with it. So went through, testified, and we were sort of chased out by a couple legislators who didn't chase us out in a bad way, but in a good way to say thank you for coming. And went out through the State House, back through security, and he kind of startled. Well, he does sometimes. And he said, oh, I forgot my pocket watch, or my pocket knife, rather. So it wasn't the cross after all. Over time, we decided to get more systematic about how we chose to advocate for issues. We recognized that an important part of this work is to offer Maine Episcopalians and other people of faith the tools to learn to exercise their faith voices, their own faith voices in the public sphere. So in late 2015, with the bishop's unfailing support, the Maine Episcopal Network for Justice was born, and John Hennessy came on board to join us in this good work, and here we are. But to get back to that first doorway conversation, in late November 2008, Steve's first op-ed in the Portland Press-Herald read, in part, with the economy in crisis, with the vastly fluctuating cost of energy, with our nation engaged in 2 wars, we live in an environment of uncertainty and fear. At times like these, it's not uncommon that our hearts turn to fear toward those who are different from us. That fear sometimes translates into violence, which creates more fear. The Episcopal Church in Maine believes its task is to help cast aside that fear, even though we too may feel it, and work to help our neighbors in the struggles that we all face in these times. That hope within us empowers us to welcome the stranger, visit the sick, feed the hungry, and take care of those whose need is great, each in our own community. Friends, with a few tweaks that could have been written last week, there is still a lot of work to be done. In our Book of Common Prayer, there is a post-communion prayer that is seldom used these days, but in which we vow, quote, to do all such good works as thou hast prepared for us to walk in. Steve Lane has never shied away from what God has prepared for him to walk in. And it has been one of the great honors and deepest joys of my life to be invited to walk with him along this way of love, in this place and for this time. Thank you.
Okay, so she went just a little long, but Scholar, activist Marvin Ellison describes himself as a theological educator for justice. An ordained Presbyterian minister, he taught Christian ethics at Bangor Theological Seminary for over 3 decades, including 20 years on the Portland campus. During that time, he founded Maine's Religious Coalition Against Discrimination and the Maine Interfaith Council for Reproductive Choices. In 2009 and again in 2012, he helped organize people of faith throughout Maine in support of marriage equality. Currently, Marvin serves as a volunteer chaplain at Planned Parenthood. Please welcome Marvin Ellison.
Good evening. Well, to be honest, I have really struggled with how I might start my remarks this evening. Now, knowing my Episcopal friends and colleagues love their King James Bible and their Elizabethan prose, I thought, well, maybe I should begin by quoting something from William Shakespeare. I even thought of Mark Antony's funeral oration at the state funeral of Julius Caesar. You know, from school days, you too might recall this passage from Act 3, Scene 2 of Shakespeare's play, which begins this way. Friends, Romans, countrymen, you do remember it. Lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. But then again, I had second thoughts because I'm fairly sure that this particular passage, even though it's Shakespeare, doesn't quite strike the right tone for tonight's celebration, so I decided to start over. So I'm starting over this time, mea culpa. I will brazenly misquote Shakespeare and really bungle Mark Antony's speech. So here goes the newly discovered New Revised Standard Version, sort of. Friends, Mainers, countrymen, countrywomen, and all residents of this nation under duress, lend me your ears. I have come not to bury Steve Lane, but to praise him. The good bishop, the good that bishops do lives after them. And may that certainly be so for this 9th bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Maine. Friends, in all seriousness, Bishop Lane has done a remarkable amount of good here in Maine, precisely because his engagement in support of human rights and building up the common good has been consistently public and courageous. Nowhere more evident than in the marriage equality movement. Maine, you know, was the first state to adopt marriage equality by popular vote. But that change didn't happen quickly or without effort. The first of Maine's 2 marriage equality referenda, the first failed to pass back in 2009. But even before then, those of us within the LGBTQ community knew that we could not make this change happen by ourselves. We would need allies, and our good fortune is that Bishop Lane stepped up early and often, as did this diocese. The first marriage campaign, you may remember, focused on securing marriage as a civil right for same-sex couples. But that language actually failed to connect with some voters who identified themselves as undecided, but almost all of whom ended up voting against the bill. So what do we know now about these voters? Research after the campaign has shown that these undecided Mainers were, for the most part, religiously affiliated, but they weren't hardcore conservatives. They reported knowing and caring about gay family members, friends, and co-workers, but they also shared, and this is telling, that they had never heard a compelling, faith-based argument in favor of allowing same-sex couples to marry. For them, talking about marriage as a right simply didn't make sense, because marriage, they said over and over, is about love and responsibility, not about legal rights bestowed by government. Now, happily, for Bishop Lane and the progressive faith community, speaking the language of values is our native tongue. When we speak up for justice and equality, we are speaking because of our faith and values, not in spite of. Wisely, the second marriage campaign in 2012 reframed marriage, this time not as a matter of rights, but rather as a matter of relationship, values, and commitment. And I think it is because of this reframing, and because countless LGBTQ people went door to door to share our lives and our hopes, I dare say that neither Maine nor marriage will ever be the same again. But what might we learn from the intense fear of those who opposed this change, including some people of faith? Now, it's true that people on the other side wish to keep gays and lesbians out of the institution of marriage. But we need to understand that their agenda was far more ambitious than mere exclusion. Their primary objective all along was focused on the cultural majority group and on their nearly frantic effort to keep heterosexual couples pinned into a conventional marriage model that sacralizes power inequality between men and women. Their fear, and it was a real fear, was that if patriarchal marriage were ever toppled, then the entire hierarchical social order itself might well collapse. For them, the dream of living in community as co-equals was frightening. It was godless. So that's the bad news. The good news is that Steve Lane's public ministry has been grounded in an abiding trust. A trust that a radically different God is at work. A justice-loving God who is unsettling the settled and creating a new heaven and a new earth. With skill and good humor, this open-hearted and gracious bishop has encouraged you and me never to settle for less. So with wisdom and humility and, yes, fierce tenderness, time and time again, he's exercised the authority of his office to empower the marginalized and show respect and regard for the dignity and well-being of all. So when all is said and done, two things I believe are needed if you want to make transitional change possible. You need a compelling moral vision, and you must have a few courageous friends. In Steve Lane, we've been blessed with both in abundance. Thank you, Steve, and thanks be to God.
Although not a native Mainer, Suzanne Roberts, who moved to Maine at age 7, will be quick to tell you that she arrived here as quickly as she could. She grew up in Western Maine and is a graduate of Freiburg Academy. She received a Bachelor of Science degree in biology from Brown University and then went on to earn a medical degree and a master's in public health from Tulane University. She completed a residency in internal medicine at Charity Hospital in New Orleans. In 2011, she received her Master of Divinity degree from Bangor Theological Seminary. Sounds like an underachiever. And in 2013, she was ordained to the priesthood at St. Luke's Cathedral. Suzanne currently works as a primary care physician for Southern Maine Healthcare in Biddeford and as a pastoral associate at St. Luke's Cathedral. She's also a clinical instructor in the Department of Medicine at Tufts University School of Medicine, where she hopes to play a small role in ensuring that our next generation of physicians remains compassionate and caring human beings. Please welcome the Reverend Suzanne Roberts, MD.
Thank you. So, you know, it's interesting. This is a powerful symbol, and this is as well. And I distinctly remember about 4 or 5 years ago talking to Bishop Lane and saying, "Can I wear them together? It feels weird and it feels a little wrong." And he said, "No, it's perfectly okay to do that in certain situations." I don't do it often, and certainly never at my other job. So 30 years ago, when I was a freshly graduated medical intern and I arrived at the medicine wards at Charity Hospital in my bright white coat and with my big, caring heart pinned right there on my white coat sleeve, my senior resident made it a point to introduce to me a bit of conventional wisdom for doctors. She pulled me aside one day and said, "Suzanne, you are never going to last in this profession if you don't remember this. The patient has the disease." I looked at her and I said, "Well, yeah, I know the patient has the disease." And she said, No, you don't understand. What I mean to tell you is this. You are the doctor, and the patient has the disease. You cannot be helpful to this patient if you are all emotionally caught up in what is ultimately their problem. And there it was, summed up in 5 simple words. The detachment that most doctors learn early in their careers as a defense against emotional and physical burnout. The patient has the disease. It's easy to understand why most doctors learn to be detached, and sometimes detachment can be helpful. But detachment, the fallback position of many physicians, is exactly the wrong attitude to take when we start to discuss social justice issues around healthcare. So this is where the voices of people of faith can make a huge difference. Healthcare providers need people of faith to participate in the healthcare debate because people of faith remind us that this detachment is artificial. This is because for people of faith, it is a given that there is no disconnect between the patient and the rest of us. They understand that when one of us is suffering, all of us are suffering. People of faith we believe that any discussion about how we as a country decide to allocate our healthcare resources needs to begin with the agreement that all people are children of God and that all people have equal right to access to healthcare. This is where the discussion needs to begin. Everyone has a right to healthcare, because apparently many of our fellow Americans still believe that some people are more deserving of care than others. And if you don't agree with this assessment, please take a moment to think about how we are currently caring for our neighbors who struggle with addiction or mental illness, or the terribly inadequate health care that we provide to our sisters and brothers who are incarcerated. Our country has the wealth and the resources to provide health care for all, but it will never happen until we care enough about one another to make it happen. So how can people of faith have an impact upon the current healthcare debate? Our voices can help to change the dialogue in so many helpful ways. We simply need to claim the power to enter into these debates. Can you imagine how the healthcare debate might change if we were to reframe it? If we were to agree that from now on, we're going to make all of our healthcare delivery decisions based upon a platform of love and care for one another. Can you imagine how the debate might change if we were to agree that from now on, all of our healthcare decisions would have to be in harmony with Jesus' great commandment that we love one another? Can you imagine how our entire healthcare system might be transformed if we approached each policy decision with the question, if we implement this proposal, will it bring us closer to following the golden rule that we treat others as we would wish to be treated? These are the type of questions that people of faith can bring into the healthcare debate. And I don't know about you, but I am excited to take part in debates like those. 30 years ago, my senior resident told me that the patient has the disease. And I thought that the best way to be an effective healer was to be detached and to be clinical. But now, because of my faith and because of the inspiration of other faith leaders who bravely speak up in these difficult policy discussions, I realize there is no separation between us, and that when any one of us is suffering, we are all suffering. Faith gives every one of us a voice to speak for our sisters and brothers who are suffering. And when we use these voices to advocate for care for all, then we will all become healers. Thank you.
So there were two people who didn't send me their remarks in advance. The Honorable Marge Kelly and Dr. Suzanne here. How did they do? Good. Amazing, absolutely amazing. Thank you. During his episcopate, Bishop Ely has been a leader both within the diocese and throughout the wider Episcopal Church on such controversial issues as marriage equality, the ordination of LGBT clergy, increased gun safety, and racial justice. He is also a leading voice on the matters of environmental and economic justice. As part of his global outreach, the bishop serves on the board of Cristasol, a non-governmental agency based in El Salvador that works to advance human rights in Central America. Additionally, he is a co-founder of the Vermont chapter of Kids for Peace, a grassroots interfaith youth movement dedicated to ending conflict and inspiring hope in Jerusalem and divided societies around the world. More locally, Bishop Ely is a leading advocate for the Vermont Ecumenical Council and Vermont Interfaith Action. And as I mentioned before, he drove the furthest to get here. Please welcome Bishop Ely.
Thank you, and for that warm welcome as well earlier. I think I'm here to remind you that bishops are aren't just owned by dioceses, but they belong to the whole church. And your bishop is a bishop who has made a difference in the wider church, and I'm here to affirm that and give thanks for that. And yeah, you can clap for that. Do I get counted for that time, John? I don't know. Maybe John stops the clock when you clap, I don't know. But so you may actually be wondering why the Bishop of Vermont would travel 4 hours and some 260 miles each way to offer an 8-minute talk about gun violence. 2 reasons. The first is my deep affection for Bishop Stephen Lane, who's been a friend and a colleague in the House of Bishops for these past 11 years. Along with Gretchen, Ann, and I, we've sort of become friends through that relationship, and it means a great deal to me. The second is because I share with him a commitment to address the epidemic of gun violence in our country through our membership as members of the Bishops United Against Gun Violence. So I'm honored to have been asked to highlight this aspect of Bishop Lane's many public faith and social justice commitments. Bishops United Against Gun Violence is a network of over 80 Episcopal Church bishops working together to curtail the epidemic of gun violence in the United States. We come from a very broad spectrum of theological and political perspectives, as well as varied experiences with firearms, including many who are gun owners. We are a big tent, geographically broad, and we are about faith. This is a faith movement. We believe in a God of life in the face of death, who calls our church to speak and act decisively. For me personally, and for Bishops United Against Gun Violence as a network, the wake-up call to action really took hold in the crucible of the Sandy Hook Elementary School mass shooting on December 14th, 2012. Happens to be my birthday. I remember leaving a church meeting that Saturday and hearing the news. I immediately called my bishop colleagues in Connecticut, my home state, and spoke with them as they were driving to Newtown. Ever since then, the leadership of the bishops of Connecticut has been central to the ministry of Bishops United Against Gun Violence. In this struggle, Bishops United Against Gun Violence offer 4 contributions. First is public liturgy, including processions, vigils, and prayer services to commemorate the dead and inspire the living. Spiritual support for those living with gunshot wounds, with grief, with fear, and with the temptation of hopelessness. And advocacy for broader and easier access to mental health services for those at risk of suicide. Third, sound teaching for those yearning to bring an ethic of Christian compassion and concern for the common good to bear on the debates regarding unjust economic and legal structures, public safety, individual rights, and our responsibilities to one another as children of God, all part of the gun debate. Persistent advocacy is the 4th area we bring for common sense gun safety measures that enjoy the support of gun owners and non-gun owners alike, such as handgun purchaser licensing, background checks on all gun purchases, restrictions on gun ownership by domestic abusers, classification of gun trafficking as a federal crime, encouragement for the development of smart gun technology, federal funding for research into gun violence prevention strategies, and the safe storage of firearms. An example of our commitment to the contribution in the area of public liturgy was this witness at the 2018 General Convention in Austin, Texas. In addition, we offer regular live Facebook prayer services, including a recent one led by presiding bishop during the March meeting of the House of Bishops. I'll be leading the Facebook Live service this coming Friday at noon. In the area of spiritual support, one of the significant contributions of Bishop Lane is a litany that is updated and used as part of our prayer services and widely throughout the church, especially following mass shootings. When it comes to sound teaching, Bishops United Against Gun Violence offer many voices, speaking in pulpits and public places, as well as articles, newspapers, magazines, church newsletters all around the country. Bishop Lane has been among the many, and most articulate offering this gift of sound and prophetic teaching and preaching. And then there is the area of persistent advocacy. Many of us, the Diocese of Maine's own Episcopal Network for Justice among them, bring our voices and our commitment to the public square, to state, local, federal legislative bodies, and to the streets of America in the cause of common sense gun safety measures that are designed to help reduce incidents of gun violence. In addition to the more widely publicized incidents of gun violence, a concern to me and to many of us in our network is the need to focus our efforts toward reducing gun violence in the areas of suicide, domestic violence, and accidental death, often involving children in homes without safe gun storage. Now, I don't need or want to spend a great deal of time on statistics related to gun violence. You can find plenty of credible statistical information and research on the Bishops United website. I did, however, come across this information about Maine from the folks associated with Maine Gun Safety and the Center for Disease Control. For me, they point to the need to seek solutions that will help lessen the incidence of gun violence, especially in those areas of suicide, domestic violence, and accidental gun violence. I also noticed that the Maine State Legislature is currently considering extreme risk gun safety legislation. Vermont passed similar legislation last year. I'm not sure how those of you, how that all went. There were some hearings on Monday. I don't know where the legislation is heading, but it may be something that some of you will want to pursue. Finally, I want to draw your attention to an effort that has become a priority for me, and I hope will be a priority of interest for you. It is the End Family Fire campaign. We heard about this first when we were in Washington, D.C., doing some advocacy work there. It's a common sense effort to reduce the incidence of accidental gun violence in homes. The statistics are sobering, but they are not inevitable. There is something we can do, something you can do to help reduce gun violence. And so if I can be so bold as to suggest that if there is nothing else you do to honor Bishop's Lane commitment to this area of social justice and public witness, please do this. Visit endfamilyfire.org and watch the video that will come up. I believe it will help you understand what's at stake and offer practical steps to save lives. Thank you. For me, it's been a joy and a privilege to have a relationship with this wonderful colleague and with Gretchen over these years. And for that, I give thanks. Thank you.
I just want to let the Bishop from Vermont know we expect that bill to pass through the House and the Senate, and we hope that this governor will sign it. Reverend Jane Field is the Executive Director of the Maine Council of Churches, a statewide ecumenical body of 7-member denominations who have a total of 437 local congregations with 55,000 members here in Maine. Jane is an ordained minister of Word and Sacrament in the Presbyterian Church USA and came to the Maine Council of Churches in 2015 after a long career serving Presbyterian, Episcopal, and Methodist churches in Connecticut, a period in her life she refers to as living in exile, since she always longed to come home to Maine. In addition to her current work as the Executive Director of the Maine Council, Jane also serves as the pastor of Faith Lutheran Church in Windham, which, she says, combined with her checkered past of serving churches from nearly every other Protestant tradition, makes her a poster child for ecumenism, or what her daughter refers to as the Pick a Lane Lifetime Achievement Award. Jane told me if she had to pick a lane, it would be Bishop Stephen Lane. I wish I'd have thought of that. And she is honored to be here tonight to pay tribute to a beloved brother in Christ for whom she has the utmost admiration, respect, and esteem. Please welcome Reverend Jane Field.
I just looked at that and thought, oh, thank God I'm not wearing the same outfit. 10 years ago, the Maine Council of Churches began promoting civil discourse in public life. Since 2010, the Council has invited all of Maine's candidates for statewide and national office to sign our covenant for civil discourse. The covenant outlines basic principles of civility, undergirded by our core belief in the inherent dignity and worth of every person as a beloved child of God. In 2012, I even figured out how to make it flash, so I get points. In 2012, the Council hosted a panel discussion on marriage equality to model civility in the midst of profound disagreement, and I think you've noticed who's on the end there, that debonair young fellow. During the marriage equality battles that ravaged the state, and with the election of Paul LePage, the Council grew increasingly concerned about disrespect, deceit, and division here in Maine. But could they have ever imagined how much worse things were going to get? By 2015, we were definitely not in Kansas anymore. Back in 2010, could the Council, could any one of us for that matter, have imagined this? That this is where we would be. And yet, things continued to spiral downward from there. Incivility has proven to be a gateway through which bias and hate enter sacred and peaceful spaces. So the Council has expanded its efforts to promote civil discourse, hosting a statewide symposium with Senator George Mitchell, launching the Community Conversations Project to bring immigrant and longtime Mainer neighbors together. And you probably can't read that, but that's Bonnie Rodden, and she's Episcopalian. So she's also the president of the Maine Council of Churches and my boss. So I know I needed to find a picture of her to put in here. And we became one of the founders of Unify Maine. Today, the Council's understanding of what we mean by civil discourse is evolving. We are learning that when people with privilege call for civility, it sometimes can be an attempt to silence marginalized and oppressed people, to preserve the status quo, and to protect the privileged from feeling uncomfortable. This is what Reverend Dr. King said in his letter from a Birmingham jail. It's what the prophet Jeremiah said, too. They have treated the wound of my people carelessly, saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace. So the Council knows we need a more nuanced approach to promoting respectful and honest discourse, one that accounts for race, gender, power, and privilege. Voices of faith can make a difference by acknowledging that an appropriate stance for the privileged, it's not as much about debating civilly as it is about self-awareness and humility, about deep listening and a willingness to be enough of a spiritual grown-up to endure discomfort when you bear witness to the anger of oppressed and marginalized people. Because that anger, it's a moral and justified response that is seeking to disrupt an immoral and unjust system. So removing the blind spots that privilege creates and resisting our fragility's incessant urge to create escape hatches from things that we find difficult or painful, we find those to be the essential tasks we're about right now in redefining what authentic civility is. So where does that leave us as people of faith? On the one hand, we Christians are fairly certain that Jesus never advocated for us to be bullies. And yes, that is a cat bullying a dog. Because I kept looking for a picture of a bully, and no matter which one I picked, it just was politically inappropriate, but Bonnie likes cats, so I could be in trouble after this picture, I'm not sure. But Jesus definitely never said, be a bully, and yet he also never said, be a doormat, despite the fact that a whole lot of people somehow got the idea that he did say just that. So how can voices of faith make a difference in an increasingly polarized world where divisions run deep and fears run high? In his first letter to the Corinthians, Paul concludes his hymn that extols the beauty and power of difference and diversity this way: "But strive for the greater gifts, and I will show you a still more excellent way." What is that way? Well, the answer comes in the very next chapter of that letter, 1 Corinthians 13, that tired old chestnut that keeps getting dragged out at weddings, even though it's not about weddings and it's not about romantic love. How many of you have had that talk with the couple in your office and then they pick it anyway? So I know, I should get a therapist. But what Paul was really trying to say was that more excellent way, it's love. Love is that excellent way. It is the greater gift, and it is the greatest challenge we must strive for. To love with a fierceness and a tenacity that's brave enough to step into that breach and that's strong enough to stay there and repair it once we get there. And that is not easy to do. Civil rights professor John Powell recently said, "People are looking for community, though we don't have any confidence in love anymore. We have much more confidence in anger and hate." Maybe so. But we are here tonight celebrating someone who has bet his life on the truth that we as Easter people reminded ourselves of just last Sunday, and that we remind ourselves of every Sunday. That love is more powerful than anger, Dr. Powell. It's more powerful than hate. It's more powerful even than death. Bishop Lane, you've shown us all that still more excellent way, how voices of faith can make a difference in this weary world. With love. Thank you.
Reverend Maria Hecker, where are you? Did you notice that reference to Kansas? All right, just for you, just for you.
Kansas is pretty bad.
Yes, it is. So I can't see our panelists. I just want to remind them that now you should go to see Zach and get your lavalier mic, and then come back into the room. Our next presenter, Ben Chin, is the Political Engagement Director of the Maine People's Alliance. He has been called a real people's champion in Maine. He's been a leader of Maine's largest community organization. I had since, and I forgot to ask you since when. I'm sorry. You want to tell us?
2007.
All right. When Ben came to Lewiston to attend college at Bates, he planned to complete his studies and move on to seminary to become a pastor. Plans changed, and now Ben and Maine People's Alliance work on protecting the environment, creating a healthy economy, fully funding public education, raising the minimum wage. You get the picture. Ben has had his own unique experience running for mayor of Lewiston in 2017. While losing in a very close runoff election, the experience has indeed solidified his commitment to social justice for all. Here's where it gets tricky. Ben has been a licensed lay preacher in our diocese, a lay person licensed by the bishop to preach. A lay preacher is trained, examined, and found competent in the Holy Scriptures, the Book of Common Prayer, and the hymnal, the conduct of public worship, the use of the voice, church history, Christian ethics, and moral theology. I almost said he is a lay preacher because that's what I was told, and then I said, no, his license expired. So I had to balance what I was going to say. Please welcome Ben Chin.
Thank you for the reminder on getting the paperwork in, John. Appreciate that.
I have done my
I love people who use drugs. 1 John chapter 4. No one has ever seen God, but when we love one another, God lives in us. I love people who use drugs. This is Sherry Monteith, who lost her sister in the opioid epidemic a few years ago. Her sister Sarah was diagnosed with a chronic condition that required painkillers. And like most people who become addicted to opioids, she couldn't get off them. She was afraid to get help. She was afraid of the police. She tried to go it alone, and she died. We're laying roses at the steps of City Hall in Lewiston to commemorate everyone in Maine who died of the overdose epidemic in the year before. And last year, that was more than one person every single day, 376. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us. Opioids are not the only drugs that people are dying from. And what we can see from the data is that drug overdose deaths, which are part of a larger phenomenon of deaths of despair, are increasing exponentially in our society, and they track almost exactly with increasing economic inequality. I love people who use drugs. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us. Unfortunately, even though it's primarily white working-class people who are perishing in this epidemic, we know one of the main reasons why we approach this problem from a perspective of criminalization and not compassion is because of the long racist history in America of the failed war on drugs, the failed war on crime. We know that we've had a governor that has peddled these racist lies as well. I love people who use drugs. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us. I want to thank Bishop Lane for the courage that we've all talked about so far today, and personally as a member of Trinity Congregation in Lewiston, for letting us really try to find our voice and experiment in a lot of different avenues of doing that. And I've relied on the sustenance I get from the institution that you've breathed life into every week to go out and do my work, and I know many of us here in this room all feel the same way. And our hope is that in this coalition, the Maine Coalition for Sensible Drug Reform, that this approach, leading with love, is true to the voice that Bishop Lane has brought to the church and to Maine. It is not the most common thing to hear someone say, I love people who use drugs, unfortunately. And at the same time, we know that that is actually the only thing that will prevent our neighbors from dying. If you're interested in learning more about how you can get involved, that's my email address. And we can share the comprehensive policy platform that this coalition is getting behind, organizations across the state that deal with real solutions to this, from prevention to harm reduction to decriminalization, treatment, recovery, and destigmatization. And we're not going to be content, even though we have, I'd say, better elected officials in Augusta, to just assume they're going to get the job done. So this is the first public time that we're talking about this part of the campaign, and pretty soon you're going to see that in public squares across the state and in the State House, a call for community leaders, including and especially faith leaders, to stand with their neighbors, with all of the families who have lost loved ones in this epidemic, to say we want to lead with love. And if you read the paper on Monday, you know that time kills. That every day, every week that goes by where the action is not taken, another life is lost. I love people who use drugs. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us. Amen.
So raise your hand if you think Ben needs to renew that license. No pressure. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Reza Jalali. Reza is a writer, educator, and a community activist who has taught at the Bangor Theological Seminary and the University of Southern Maine. Reza, a former refugee from Kurdistan, Iran, was recognized as one of the eminent ethnic Americans in Making It in America, a source book on eminent ethnic Americans, and was named one of Maine's 50 leaders by Maine Magazine. As a member of Amnesty International USA Board of Directors, Reza has led delegations to different refugee camps in Turkey and Bosnia. He has participated in numerous United Nations-sponsored international conferences, and in 1992, he visited the White House as part of a national delegation to discuss the plight of Kurdish refugees fleeing Iraq. Jalali is one of the contributing writers to Child Labor, A Global View and the World of Child Labor, and Historical and Regional Survey. He has written the foreword to New Mainers, a book on Maine's immigrants. His children's book, Moon Watchers, has received a Skipping Stones Honor Award for multicultural work. Jalali's short story collection, Homesick, Mosque, and Other Stories, was published in 2013. His play, The Poets and the Assassin, which is about women in Iran and Islam, has been staged numerous times. He's been a storyteller in the National Public Radio's nationally acclaimed The Moth Radio Hour. He has been included in 50 in 52 Journey, a national project to name Americans who are problem solvers, idea generators in their communities, in their cities, and in their states. And they are moving America forward. He directed the USM Office of Multicultural Student Affairs at USM and advised Muslim students at Bates and Bowdoin College before teaching at USM's honors program as an adjunct faculty. Please welcome Dr. Reza Jalali.
Thank you so much. What an honor. Thank you, John, for the great introduction. As you can imagine, I feel honored to be here to add my voice as a new Mainer to honor my mentor, teacher, and friend, Bishop Lane. Now, if I were to title my brief remarks this evening, I would have called it The Bishop and the Muslim. Or to be more precise, I would have called it The Very Kind Bishop and the Very Grateful Muslim. I recall with joy the first luncheon meeting that I had with Bishop Lane. There I was, a former refugee, a displaced person trying to sound smart, and trying so hard in my personal journey in becoming American and a Mainer, while learning about the intricacy of life in Maine. For example, how to cook the fiddleheads, where to pick up the best wild raspberries, how to pronounce the long names of towns, communities, and regions with multiple syllables, and so on. And here I was sitting down to lunch with the bishop with a heart. Did I mention I'm a Muslim from the Middle East? There we were breaking bread, sharing stories, talking, and trying mightily, if I may add, as the task required, perhaps with a holy sense of hopefulness, to fix the word between the two of us. And why not? I thought fixing the word was in the job descriptions of all the bishops. By the end of the lunch, I knew I had found an ally and discovered that I, like most people, needed my own bishop. As I also have mentioned in the past, I need my own rabbi in order to survive the darkness and tyranny of our times. If the gentle soul that hides behind the calm, kind, and smiling face of Bishop Lane had guessed the uproar inside me, for I could not believe my good fortune, how blessed I was, that I was with him, he showed no sign of it. There were other meetings to follow. One that I remember fondly included other guests who they too were wards displaced and refugees, two young, smart, French-speaking asylum seekers from Africa. The humble, kind type who, when shaking your hand or receiving something with you, they touch their own arm, to be exact, in the elbow area, and to show appreciation. I love this African tradition. In the Middle East, where I come from, we touch our heart with our right hand. In India, where I went to school before coming to Maine, people bring their palms together, folded, to show respect, to greet, and so on. Such beautiful gestures. It's a joy to see compassion return with compassion, people being humble, being kind. These are the very moments, including the one that we were having lunch with Bishop Lane, that we do see each other as children of the same God, that we see the common humanity that connects us. These are the rare moments that might as well time should stop fleetingly to allow the divine and sacred flames that I believe exist inside each and every one of us to tremble with excitement, with a promise that it could become a roaring fire if given the chance to burn down the walls that divide us as the children of the same Creator. So there we were, meeting with Bishop Lane, leading the conversation, discussing possible ways to have these two bright young women attend college in their new home in Maine. With their immigration status in limbo, they faced many barriers in order to continue their higher education. Bishop Lane recognized their plight. Their lives were in limbo, their hopes and dreams suspended. And now, mind you, not because they'd done anything wrong, for no fault of theirs, but because our world is such a dangerous place. They were young and hopeful, and Bishop Lane and I knew this simple fact. They were the future of a state and a country that we loved so much. This was faith in action. This was what religions ask us to do, welcoming the stranger, extending a helping hand, offering hope, loving those who have been abandoned by the world. That afternoon, I witnessed firsthand what some call radical compassion or radical hospitality. I call it the celebration of the dignity of God's forgotten children. I count it as a validation of the Abrahamic values. But mind you, standing for social justice and speaking for those who are silenced can be risky. Let me explain. Weeks later, my good friend Heidi Schott, you already heard from her, suggested Bishop Lane and I co-author an op-ed about immigration to rehumanize Maine's immigrants. What could possibly go wrong? The op-ed was published in the Bangor Daily News, while many readers, including many of our friends, enjoyed reading about immigration and immigrants. Some seemed to dislike what we had to say. Let's call them the whining bunch. Now, you should never, ever read the readers' comments section, never. And I hope and pray that my dear bishop was spared the pain that I experienced reading some of the comments. They were nasty. Now, I'm used to receiving hate mails. Welcome to my life. No one said being a Muslim and being an immigrant in today's America was going to be easy. In fact, I call them my pen pals from hell. Fans that you would never ever want to meet in real life. They usually begin by encouraging me to go back to where I came from. Now, mind you, they must have missed a few classes on geography while in school, because usually I'm asked to go back to Africa, Arabia, Islamia, and even Narnia. Bishop Lane believes immigrants are more than mouths waiting to be fed. They are hands that build, hearts that are filled with love, minds that imagine. Exactly the ones we desperately need in our aging state. As an ally, he has invited us as immigrants to sit at the table by adding chairs. He has offered us dignity, and for that I call him a true Christian, a true servant of God, as, by the way, many of you sitting in this room are. I suspect Bishop Lane's tireless advocacy on behalf of Maine's immigrant has something to do with the fact that our respective faith traditions, every one of them, include a refugee as a central figure. Refugees, innocent, displaced by violence, feeling persecution, searching for safety, have occupied the humanity's collective imagination. Their stories define who we are and who we could become. Let me offer an example or two. In the Old Testament, we read the story of Joseph. It's an epic in jealousy, betrayal, slavery, adultery, ending in forgiveness and reconciliation. Seriously, it resembles a Hollywood blockbuster. The central character is Joseph, Yusuf in Hebrew and Yusuf in Arabic. His plight of being favored by his father, as you know, only to be hated by his brothers who conspire to get rid of him by making up his death and sending him as a slave to Egypt, is similarly repeated in Islam's holy book, the Quran. We all know once in Egypt, he rejects his master's wife's unwanted sexual adventure. You could say the first, or maybe not the first, biblical sexual harassment. Yet all the same, he ends up being accused of adultery and is imprisoned. After being saved from prison, Joseph, an immigrant in today's term, is seen by Egypt's Pharaoh as a wise man filled with God's Spirit, and as such appointed to a position of power. Joseph, the outsider, advises the Egyptian to save food during the years of abundance to use later when the 7-year famine hits Egypt. In short, the universal story of a grateful immigrant returning the favor offered to him by the host nation. Of course, there are other well-known ancient Middle Eastern refugees mentioned in the sacred text common to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Abraham, Moses, Mary, Jesus, Hajar to us in Islam, and Muhammad, peace be upon them all, each crossing borders in one time or another in search of safety and security, food, or following a divine promise. Prophet Muhammad, persecuted for speaking of the oneness of God in a city of idol worshippers, was chased away from Mecca, Islam's birthplace, to find refuge in Medina. Mary, the world's most famous and adored single mother, was escaping the King Herod's soldiers by fleeing to Egypt. A fact that we adore and honor these ancient refugees seem to be lost to the anti-immigrant forces that control today's national narrative. I know for sure that Bishop Lanes believes offering protection and assistance to Maine's refugees and asylum seekers is what Christianity, Judaism, and Islam require us to do. Politicians come and go. Immigration is not a red and blue issue. It's about the soul of America. Immigration and how we treat those fleeing persecution, wars, and poverty define us as Americans. And we as a nation don't seem to have a good record on immigration. We don't. Those who came before us experienced religious persecution and racism here in America. We should remember how, as a country, we turned our back on the Jewish refugees escaping the violence in Europe. How we let the government keep Japanese citizens in a camp. Maine has had its own troubled history. In Bath, Maine, a Roman Catholic church was burned down by a mob. Similarly, today's immoral policies, such as Muslim ban, family separation, and putting children in cages, the name-calling, the dehumanizing of Mexicans and Central American asylum seekers are un-American. This is not who we are. This is not who we are. Bishop Lane shows us the way. Ultimately, it might be up to us, the faithful in Maine, to resist the tyranny and the hatred coming from those in power. In Maine, the so-called unchurched state in the country, it is the churches, synagogues, and the mosques which are offering hope to those in need. Finally, to my teacher and friend, Bishop Lane, I shall miss your smiles, lessons on radical compassion and hospitality, in adding a chair at the to the table, the generosity of speaking to me from your heart and treating me as a family. With my right hand on my chest, as my tradition requires, I thank you for all you've done for us, the world's displaced people now calling Maine home. I shall miss our luncheons, long chats, and plodding to repair our broken world. May your days be filled with joy and peace, inshallah, God willing.
We're going to mix this up a little bit, but before we do that, I would ask, and we are running just a few minutes behind, so bear with us, but another round of applause for everyone who has spoken so far this evening. Thank you so much. We're going to have a conversation with three faith leaders from around our state, and I'm going to start with the introduction of the Reverend Deborah J. Blood, who's the conference minister of the Maine Conference of the United Church of Christ and chair of the Council of Conference Ministers of the National United Church of Christ. Before her call to leadership in the Maine Conference, she served for 10 years as pastor of the First Congregational Church of Bloomfield, Connecticut, a multiracial, multi-ethnic congregation dedicated to justice, peace, and compassion for all peoples. She is delighted to serve in Maine as someone with a strong family heritage in Maine and a lifetime of vacationing in this remarkable place. Her first trip was climbing as far as Chimney Pond on Mount Katahdin, most of it on her father's shoulders, on her 5th birthday. Before entering ordained ministry, Deborah worked briefly as a music teacher and practiced law for 15 years. Much of her focus was in family law and mediation, with an emphasis on representing children. It was a ministry, and eventually God made it clear that her vocation should evolve to the church. Her participation in the life of the church is broad. She has had extensive training in mediation and conflict resolution for churches and has contributed this expertise in various settings. In the national setting, Deborah has chaired the wider church ministries and common global ministries boards and traveled widely under the auspices of global ministries. Reverend Blood is passionate about justice and inclusion in the Maine Conference UCC and its congregations, and grateful for this opportunity to work collaboratively with people of faith throughout the state of Maine for a just world for all. Please join us on the stage, Reverend Blood, while I introduce Rabbi Carolyn Braun. In 1979, with a BA in 19th century American and English literature in hand, Rabbi Braun spent 2 years at the Hillel Foundation at MIT before beginning her journey to the rabbinate. In 1984, she received a master's degree in Judaic studies from the Jewish Theological Seminary. That very year, the decision was made to accept women in the rabbinical program. Rabbi Braun entered with the first class of women and was ordained in 1988. Following her ordination, Rabbi Braun spent 6 years at Mount Holyoke College, where she was the first rabbi and full-time Jewish chaplain. Her congregation included faculty, staff, students, and individuals both within and outside the college community. In December of '94, Rabbi Braun left Mount Holyoke and assumed her present position as rabbi at Temple Bethel. Among her many roles as a spiritual leader, Rabbi Braun has been involved in interfaith activities, served on the board of directors of the United Way, the Chaplains Advocacy Council at Bates College, and the Maine Interfaith Council for Reproductive Choices. Presently, she serves on the Medical Ethics and Pastoral Services Committees at Maine Medical Center and is on the board of Maine Initiatives, Maine Citizens Against Handgun Violence, Wayne Fleet School, and the Martin Luther King Site Selection Committee for the City of Portland. When does she sleep? Rabbi Braun lives in Portland with her hound, Ruby. Please join us on the stage, Rabbi. In typical Steve Lane fashion, he asked me to skip the intro because you've all heard it all. So Bishop Lane, come on up. We have 2 core questions for each of you to respond to. They did get the questions in advance. To share some of your insights about what you've heard tonight and where you think we might be going around our faith work in the future. So I would start with Reverend Blood and ask, how are current politics changing how do you think current politics are changing religious attitudes and behaviors? And if you don't think they are, you can say, no, I don't think they are.
So we all talked to each other ahead and said, who can answer this? So thank you for letting me go first. I was struck by the first speaker who talked about the moment of debating with another person, each of them on diametrically opposed viewpoints, speaking from, because I'm a Christian, I believe. And I think that's defining for where we are. People could, from any faith tradition, because I'm a Christian, because I am Jewish, because I am Muslim, because I believe, and come up with diametrically opposed viewpoints in the world we're in. And if I, as a Christian, or any of us, if I affirm out loud that every single person is a beloved child of God, it is a profoundly religious statement. It's at the core of my faith. And it is fully political. Because to affirm that, if we would really act on that, would utterly change our political landscape. So I was sitting here this evening trying to figure out really how you separate politics from religion, how you set up this question of it's one or the other. We have people in our churches, in the United Church of Christ, I'm sure it's true for the Episcopal Church and every other faith community, who as soon as a pastor preaches a clear word of the gospel, preaches from the Sermon on the Mount, will walk out of the church because they don't want to hear politics in church. I don't think we're alone in that. So how do we talk? I mean, yes, of course, our discourse has changed and it's our political climate. It's lovely to be here this evening. This is I'm inspired and impressed. And I'm sure it's not uniform, but we think alike. How would we have this conversation? How would I feel that I could start this conversation with someone who was an avowed Trump supporter, if I can just speak it out loud? So the religious landscape, I don't know. I don't know that it's religion that's changed. I do think I'm thinking as I'm speaking, that it's the political standpoint that's forcing us in some ways to claim our religious identity. I know that is true for me in many ways. It forces us, I hope, to be less civil and more prophetic. And I think that is what's happening for me, for many of us, that we must speak up. To just merely be civil won't do. So those are just some thoughts, a little stream of consciousness.
Thank you. Rabbi, what have you got to add?
Well, first of all, if I ever get to retire, I want all of you to speak at my retirement. Including Bishop Lane. Come back. Because of the inspiration, as I tried to work on this question, thinking there must be an answer that I'm just not finding. And what's interesting is I came up with much of what you just said. And what I was languishing about in my seat as I heard all this was the difficulty I have in speaking about anything that might be construed as political in my synagogue, even though Jews are, usually right out there, and thank God our congregation, I know the other congregations have done some really wonderful things, but Jews are a little different because they don't exactly come to synagogue, so you have to reach them in a different way. But 2 years ago, my father had passed away, and I gave a sermon for the high holidays about loss. And it was also the year that President Trump became president. And so I started to talk about civility and incivility and loss. And a bunch of people left the congregation, left the room. And I couldn't believe it. And I asked them, did they hear the whole sermon? Because it was a pretty good sermon, if I do say so myself. And they did not. And so I said to them, I'm going to read something to you. It comes from our liturgy on Yom Kippur, and I want to ask you if you will walk out on this. And it says, it is Isaiah, and he's talking about fasting, which is what's happening on Yom Kippur. And he says, what kind of fasting are you doing? You're just not eating? No, this is the fast I desire, to unlock the fetters of wickedness, to untie the cords of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke, to share your bread with the hungry. I went on and on. I said, would you walk out on this? And they didn't answer me. And so I think that there's so much polarization right now. People are so fearful. I think it comes from fear that it's very hard to have these discussions which is why I am so honored to be here tonight with someone who has engaged in these discussions, who has brought the church into these discussions, the whole community, and much of Maine. And these are hard times. These are very hard times.
That passage from Isaiah is a foundational one for me. My sense is that the polarization has been very shaking for the church. I remember shortly after the last presidential election, I began to get phone calls about why was I speaking out about immigrants, as though that were new, as though it had started in response to the election and was my political pushback against the election. And I reminded people that we'd been talking about immigrants in Maine through the entire Obama administration. And I hadn't been awfully pleased with Obama on immigration either.
Right.
We had a conversation within the diocese about the gospel, the good news of faith in Jesus Christ and in God isn't in a political agenda. We were feeding the hungry before the president was elected, and we're going to continue. And so I think for us, the shaking has forced us to do some re-examination of who we are and a rerouting. And I have a sense of a kind of firming up that, okay, all right, the world is changing, that's not new. But the gospel is unchanged, and our commitments are unchanged. And so to assert love for neighbor, we've been doing that for several thousand years, I believe, and we ought to continue. And if it's become politicized, we need to recognize that, but we shouldn't then say we won't love our neighbors. We have to affirm that value, that Abrahamic value. We were all strangers in Egypt at one time. So for me, it's the change for us in the church has been that we've had to dig deeper, reroute, reconnect, be clear about that what we're about is not a political platform, but care for the ones God loves best, the poor, the weak, the lost, the lonely.
We brainstormed this second question, how are religious behaviors changing politics, before the phenomenon called Mayor Pete. But this question is very, very relevant. How are religious behaviors changing politics? Rabbi, let's start with you.
I only
If you
did
don't like the
number
question-
one. I don't know that I got to number two.
If you don't like the question, just say something else.
So how are religious behaviors changing politics? Well, I can, to the benefit or to the detriment of politics, I mean, I think that that there are those religious who will change the religion in some way or another, to hide behind it, to bring forward hatred or fear or nastiness or the religious right, which is true in Judaism and it's true in all religions, I imagine, that those people who, and it's always been this way, who want to hide behind their religion all of a sudden become quite religious in what they're doing. And I am hoping that these messages that we are bringing, that you are bringing, are also entering into or coming into contact with those negative messages out there. I mean, I just think that we have to stand up constantly and say, no, we are about love. We are about welcoming the stranger. We are about this. And the religious, I hope I don't care. The religious right, can go pound sand because whatever.
Don't worry, we can edit that part out.
Okay, please do. I mean, I'm not always proud about how religion affects the rest of the conversation, but we can be proud of what we do.
Thank you. Bishop?
Well, I agree. I don't think religion's a panacea, and there are lots of religious voices. My sense, though, is that the culture is increasingly secular, and the culture as a whole knows less and less about religious values, and looks at the headlines with some distaste often, and it turns away from what they perceive to be problematic sets of values and beliefs in the culture, which I think creates an opportunity for us to talk about the love of God in a way that may be new for some people. And I think while there are a multiplicity of voices, we can't withdraw from the field. Because if we do, then the word of God's love for all God's people will be lost. Because the culture at large doesn't know it anyway. The culture at large, I think, fears religion or fears the divisiveness that religion can cause, and is waiting to hear that there's something greater, and that's love. There is, and that they are loved, and that they are valued by God infinitely for who they are. That's something we can really bring to the table. But we got to flex our muscles. We got to do that.
You certainly can.
I'm not sure that the compassionate religious voice has ever been the majority voice out there. I mean, we can show it in our religions. I mean, my understanding of well, I'll just speak about mine. Moses wasn't, so beloved by the people all the time, and certainly the prophets had their own problems. So it's interesting because I have a feeling that what we call secularization has always been there. It's like a misunderstanding of religious thought, and it's really what's difficult is to bring a religious message. I mean, my challenge is always to make that religious message sound secular. And then it can be heard by people.
Places where some of our church, so we're all having the pressures on mainline churches. Places where we grow most are when people find that we're walking the walk. So the churches that are in our language is open and affirming of LGBTQ people. The churches where we really live our justice clearly attract people, because so many people have found religion to be lukewarm. But when we are true to our values, to the love of all people, to the love of God, people come. And they may not like the trappings that we've had of the way we've done our church, but that core message and the beloved community that people can go to and have that sense of acceptance. I'm sure you have the same thing, LGBTQ people who've been rejected by the church over their lifetimes, who find a home and find acceptance and are radical then. I mean, who will spread that in their communities. I wonder at your question, I wonder what the effect, how did you phrase it? You said what the effect of religion is on politics. I wonder but what the effect could be. And I wish for a moment when we could be reconcilers. What is there for the person that's sitting on one side saying, I'm a Christian and therefore I believe in exclusion, and I sit on the other side, I'm a Christian and therefore I believe in inclusion. How do we walk that? There's a Walter Wink, The Third Way, that way of never giving up who we are and our beliefs and standing in compassion with knowledge that that person is God's beloved child. How could we do that? For our society is so fractured. Could we have a room full of people with differing opinions who could not just civilly but passionately and lovingly work together for a better world?
So I work out at a gym. People who, actually it wasn't on that list, but I'm a power lifter too. But my trainer is a Trump supporter. And a lot of my friends have told me that I should leave, that we shouldn't engage in conversation. And I've known him for years and years, and over these years, being engaged in this conversation with him has been illustrative for me because I can personalize what he's talking about. He, who is half Jewish, is watching some sort of evangelical guy on television right now. So it's really great because he throws verses at me, I throw them back at him, and we have this great conversation. But I was thinking of the reconciling that happens when we engage one another, and that's the only way it can happen is if we're the anti-polarizers. And that's what you've taught us, I think.
Michael Curry says that no matter how fraught the situation, you look for a common place. Let's talk about weightlifting. And then as fellow...
So much more interesting than religion.
As fellow weightlifters, you can have a relationship and respect one another as weightlifters, and there's a place to begin. Where we recognize one another as human beings and children of God, and who knows what's possible then.
Exactly.
And regrettably, we need to leave it there. I knew this was going to be a valuable conversation. I thank all three of you for participating, and I knew the conversation would flow as it did. I didn't know we were going to talk about lifting weights, but...
I have to sneak that in there somewhere.
So please stay seated just for one more minute, and do me a favor and give... Jeremy, who's been doing our live stream, and Zach doing our lights and sound, a round of applause. For someone who is intimidated by technology, the systems at USM are world-class, as are their operators. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
This brings our evening to a close. It has been a very full look back at the work of an authentic faith-based leader. 4 years ago, when Bishop Lane and Heidi asked me to fill in during her sabbatical, I never imagined the work we would do on behalf of the diocese. I am forever grateful that our paths have crossed in such a meaningful way. And Bishop Lane, I would ask you to close us out in prayer, if you don't mind.
Just a word of thanks, John, and all of you for this evening. I'm deeply humbled and very grateful, and need to say that it's really only possible because of the community that you saw here tonight. This is work we do together, and I have been equally inspired and encouraged by many, many others of you in this room, and colleagues who have worked with me. I also want to say that the place I think I begin in all of this work is the notion that I got from Paul that governments, in their awkward way, are attempting an approximation of the kingdom of God, of the reign of God, that they're empowered by God, says Paul, to govern the people, and they should do that fairly and with equity. But of course, all political processes are fraught and prone to sin. And so they stand under the critique of the reign of God. Every government is only an approximation of divine intent. And so no government, I think Ben said he wasn't a real big fan of the previous administration. Well, our stance is always one of loving critique, because we have something higher in mind than the latest policy statement. And we know the latest policy statement will only go so far in conforming to the will of God. So our work, I think, is ongoing work of helping government be what it's supposed to be, which is the reign of God. It's not quite there yet, so we got work to do, but it's good work. Thank you all very much. Let us pray. May God bless you with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may live deep within your heart. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless you with tears, to shed for those who suffer pain, rejection, starvation, and war, so that you may reach out your hand to comfort them and to turn their pain into joy. And may God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in the world, so that you can do what others claim cannot be done. May it be so. Amen.
We're good.